All right, so we are live now. Thank you, Minister, for joining us. So welcome everyone to another Brainstorm Room webinar. The Brainstorm Room is a free not-for-profit business resource powered and sponsored by E3 Business Accountants. For today's webinar, we have a special guest, the Honourable Grant Robertson, Deputy Prime Minister, and most importantly for our audience today, Minister of Finance. I also note that the Minister is the Minister for Infrastructure, Racing, Sport and Recreation. So that's a lot to be responsible for. So thank you, Minister, for taking time out today to engage with over 200 small business owners throughout New Zealand. This webinar enables the owners of small Kiwi businesses to ask questions directly to the Minister, with whom many have regarded as the most influential person impacting on the entire business landscape. The agenda today is actually quite simple. First, the Minister will take 4 to 5 minutes sharing his understanding of the contribution the thousands of small businesses make to our economy and how this influences his and the government's policies. After that, we'll get straight into the question and answer session. Now, many of you have already sent in questions, while others have said that they prefer to ask questions during the webinar itself. If you wish to ask a question, enter it into the question area on the right sidebar or just enter the chat session. If your question is relevant to others in our audience, it can be upvoted, which means it will get priority. Now, I want to emphasise that this is not a forum to launch into political baiting and point scoring. Out of respect for the Minister's commitment to join us today, please ask questions that are specific to the Minister's policies as the impact on your small business, rather than just make statements. I will do my best to moderate questions, so we not only use this webinar to learn from the Minister, but also let him know what impact the government's policies have on the success or failure of small businesses. Now, to put all this into context, at last count, there are 487,602 small businesses in New Zealand. They employ 30% of our working population and produce 27% of our GDP. Welcome again, Minister. Your audience is waiting.
Well, kia ora and ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa. Greetings to all of you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. It's a good opportunity to have a large number of people here. The beauty of the technology we have from right around the country, and I look forward to your questions over the next 40 minutes or so. I thought what I'd do just for my introductory comments, knowing that we will get into some detail about small business particular issues in the question time, is just to run you through where the government sees the 3 big areas that we need to work on over this term of government. And the first of those is to continue to keep New Zealanders safe from COVID-19. Each morning, one of the things I do is check on where things are at with COVID around the world through a variety of different websites. And if you woke up this morning, you would have seen that in a number of countries, including the US, but also into Europe as well, we are seeing the 3rd wave of infections of COVID-19 taking hold, and a number of countries are seeing increase in the numbers of deaths and increases in the number of cases. Our rolling average for the number of cases that we're catching at the border when they come to New Zealand is, I think, still around about 4 or 5 a day, and this is despite the fact that people have to undertake pre-departure testing before they leave. A number of reasons why, even if they do have to do that, they may not be being picked up. That includes what happens to them in transit, but also the reliability of some of the testing at the other end. So all of that is to point out the fact that the pandemic has not gone away. Were we not catching those cases at the border, then they would be cases that would enter our community, potentially cause community outbreaks, which would lead to significant pressure on our health system and ultimately, unfortunately, a large number of deaths. So the COVID-19 pandemic continues, and it continues to be our job to keep New Zealanders safe. In order to do that, we are continuing, obviously, with the arrangements that we have at the border, and that includes the restrictions that we have on people entering, needing to go into managed isolation and quarantine. That will be with us in some form for the rest of this year, and I don't want to sugarcoat that at all. Where we want to see some progress, obviously, is in the development of the Trans-Tasman Safe Travel Zone, and Cabinet will, on the 6th of April, make its decision on the date for that commencing. Some really good work going on there, but again, just really emphasising the point that this is still an ongoing issue for our country, with Brisbane going into a 3-day lockdown this week in response to an outbreak there. That's the kind of thing we need to have the correct protocols in place to deal with in terms of the way we manage that Trans-Tasman Safe Travel Zone. So I's have been dotted and T's have been crossed there, and we're very optimistic that we'll be moving forward reasonably quickly there. Equally with the Pacific, we've got arrangements moving forward, and you would have seen the Cook Islands Prime Minister here this week, and an indicative date of May there that we're working towards. Therein lies some issues for us in terms of making sure that we don't want to be an exporter of COVID to anywhere in the world, and we want to make sure that we are very careful with the procedures that we put in place, particularly at the Cook Islands end, in terms of if the worst were to happen, making sure that there were facilities available for isolation, proper testing, proper contact tracing, etc. We're working very closely with the Cooks and indeed with Nui as well on these issues, and as I say, indicative date of May there to support that. The other part of keeping New Zealanders safe from COVID is our vaccination program, well underway now. New Zealand being in the fortunate position because we don't have COVID at scale or at all in the community, we've been able to adopt a different approach than others by firstly vaccinating our border staff, and we're well through that. We're now moving into our frontline health workers and their families in both cases, and then we will ramp that program up, and then from July onwards will be when we are doing our mass vaccination program. Can I just say a small advertisement here that as business owners, many of you, we are looking for your help in being able to support vaccination. Vaccination will not be compulsory, but we do need as many people as possible to be vaccinated in order for us to move forward and start to open the borders up in terms of people movement. We need your help in supporting vaccination campaigns, working closely with business organisations, with your local DHB, in making sure that you support your workers through that process. From July onwards, this will be an incredibly important thing, and New Zealand has never tried to vaccinate this many people all in one go, and so it'll be all hands to the pump to make that happen. So look, all of that represents, and there are other elements to this as well, but all of that represents a very important part of us by the beginning of 2022, feeling comfortable that we're in a position to be much more open in terms of people movement to the rest of the world. The second area that we're focusing on is in accelerating our economic recovery from COVID-19. Many different facets to this, some of which are directly attributable to small business, but in particular for us, it's about making sure that we continue to support our exporters. And so the massive program we've undertaken, hundreds of millions of dollars to ensure that we still have flights coming in and out of New Zealand in terms of exports continues. The program we've got to support construction and the work of the construction industry is a massive investment, as is our investment across the economy in supporting the tourism industry and supporting other sectors to be able to grow and thrive. I'm happy to go into more detail about this. A big underpinning of that is the investment we've made in skills and training, and I'm very pleased by the fact that since the 1st of July last year, we've had over 100,000 people come into our free trades training program. Massive support for employers to keep their apprentices on as well, and that remains really important. And then thirdly and finally, in terms of the kind of major areas of focus for us, is laying the foundations for addressing three of the biggest issues that will face New Zealand over the coming decades, and that is the well-being of children, our housing affordability and our ability to get more people into their first homes, and also questions around how we deal with climate change in a way that is a fair and just transition to the lower carbon economy we need. Obviously, we've made some announcements in recent days around housing. I want to be clear that that's part of a package, and we will continue to support the building of more housing while at the same time seeking to shift the balance towards first home buyers and dampen down some of the speculated demand. The work on climate change is really important for all of us, and I do want to recognise for small businesses looking ahead, some of the transitional issues there are going to be challenging. We want to be able to be there supporting businesses through that, just as we have through the COVID period. So look, I can leave it there, and we'll come to the more detailed questions, I think, around the small businesses now.
Thanks, Minister. That's a very good intro. Now, a recurring question that's come through what contact does the Minister have with small business owners? Where, how, and when does this occur?
So in my day-to-day life as a person who lives in my community and is still a local MP, I'm still the MP from Wellington Central here, I'm dealing virtually every day with people who are in small and medium enterprises, and I make an effort to go out and talk to them as often as I can when I'm in the community and hear from them on the issues that they have. Then from a government perspective, we obviously have a Minister for Small Business, that's the Honourable Stuart Nash, and Stuart reports regularly through to us at the Cabinet level or in ministerial meetings around the work that he's got. In turn, of course, as you know, he has a Small Business Advisory Council, which we get further feedback from through the work that we do. I spend a lot of time with chambers of commerce around the country, and pretty much every time I'm anywhere in New Zealand, I'll be there with the chambers, making sure that I'm meeting people on the ground. The individual chamber heads I talk to on a very regular basis. So I'm feeling like I'm getting a good train of information and thought coming through there. And obviously New Zealand's a small place, and it's one of the good things about New Zealand is that, you know, I'm stopped in the street by people often. I'm also, you know, spoken to pretty much at every public event I'm at around issues that affect SMEs. So we've got a formal channel through Minister Nash and his advisory group work, and then the huge variety of informal channels that mark out being a politician in New Zealand.
Thank you, Minister. Interesting you mentioned Stuart Nash, because I think he may be one of our next guests, because he's the Minister, as you say, of small business and also of tourism. So very relevant to some of the things in our audience today. Now, a question here, has the Prime Minister's desire for a COVID-free and healthy country overruled the mental and financial stress that the owners of small businesses are going through, especially those in the entertainment, hospitality, events and tourism sectors? Are these types of businesses the sacrificial lambs and the price we have to pay to be COVID-free?
You perhaps won't be surprised to learn that I don't see it that way. The elimination strategy that we've adopted has enabled New Zealand to operate at as close to normal levels as possible for a very extended period over the last year. I think the last time I looked, the Oxford University Stringency Index shows that we've had the 4th lowest number of days in any form of lockdown of any economy in the world. So that's the strategy we took, was to be able to say, you know, if we can eliminate this virus and then stamp it out when it rises again, that enables us to operate in a way that other countries simply haven't been able to. And going through that process, obviously, we recognise the impact that it's had, and therefore that's why we put in place the wage subsidy scheme, which is why we put in place the small business cash flow loan scheme. It's why we've now got the resurgence payments that were paid out through this latest brief lockdown period that we had in Auckland. And so, you know, we recognise the stress and the pressure that's there, and we've attempted to provide support in those areas, additional direct support for our tourism sector as well, because we know that there are particular places, regions, sectors that have stresses, but there's no suggestion whatsoever of the kind of tone or language of that question in the way that we're thinking. It is simply about making sure that New Zealand can operate, and that our small businesses are given an ability to operate in mostly normal circumstances, rather than very long extended periods of not being able to operate at all, which is what has been seen in a number of other countries around the world who've taken a different approach.
Okay, so we, in the last quarter through to December, we had a 1% decrease in our economic activity, and yet our cousins across the ditch, they expanded their economy by 3.2%, despite their battles with China, with their trade battles with China. So, abundance of caution, do you think that this is pulling back our economy? Despite what you've just said, we can't compete yet with Australia as far as that quarter. Will our quarter for the March quarter, you think, will be better? And can we catch up with Australia?
Yeah, well, again, it pays to be careful about just judging things on individual quarters' activities. If you go back to the September quarter, New Zealand had close to 13.9% jump in GDP, which was far in excess of what Australia had had. It bounces around between Australia and New Zealand in terms of who does what in what particular quarter. But if you look at it from the December quarter, the comparable December quarter of 2020 to 2019, New Zealand actually has done better than Australia, if you want to compare those two quarters directly together with each other on an annual basis. So look, we will see some bouncing around in our GDP numbers. I think you would have seen from virtually every commentator talking about the December quarter that they do not expect some of the things that led to that drop in the December quarter to continue. For example, there was a drop off in construction activity, which actually doesn't bear out the information that we're seeing from activity on the ground. That was potentially more of a recoil effect from a very, very big jump in the September quarter. It does, however, relate that particular issue to something that I'm sure will come up in the course of the next half an hour, which is around supply chain related issues in that construction industry. And obviously we're looking very closely at what we can do to improve that. However, we're in a global environment where those issues are challenging to us. We've also got some labour force issues, although the big boost we've had in apprenticeship numbers in the construction sector is certainly helping out there. So no, I don't think that we should see ourselves particularly in a negative light compared to Australia. I think we're actually doing very well, and it's relatively similar, although quarter by quarter it might bounce around together. I guess the other thing I'd say is, all joking aside about our competition that we might have with Australia on the sports field and elsewhere, it's actually very good for New Zealand that the Australian economy is also doing well as the New Zealand one is relative to the rest of the world, because so much of our trade is with Australia. And so actually I think we should look at the fact that both countries have done fairly well compared to the rest of the world, and we'll keep moving forward over the next few months. But clearly, we are in a period of extreme volatility in the world, and New Zealand has overall done well. And I think I'll take my benchmark from the fact that the likes of the IMF and the ratings agencies, Standard & Poor's and others, have been here recently, or virtually been here recently, and have given us a tick of approval, lifted our credit rating, the only country in the world to have our credit rating lifted since the pandemic began, first time since 2011 from Standard & Poor's. So, I think overall the judgment is that we're doing okay. Of course, we want to keep doing better. Of course, we don't like seeing a number like that in the December quarter, but I think the volatility will mean that we're just going to have to be a little bit patient over the next few months until we get things a little bit more certain in the whole world.
Here's an interesting one. Why are desperately needed fruit pickers not allowed in the country and the Wiggles are? Nothing against the Wiggles, of course. Maybe you've got some tickets there, Minister. So why not fruit pickers? It's heartbreaking to see what we are best at rotting on the ground. So we let the Wiggles in, but we can't get the fruit pickers in.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say I'm going to disagree with the premise of the question again. We've let just over 2,000 regional seasonal employment workers, the RSE scheme workers, into New Zealand specifically in order to be able to continue the work the really important work in our horticulture sector. We've also got people here on working holiday visas, and we've extended those working holiday visas to allow people to be able to stay and continue to be part of industries, including the horticulture industry. And in a time at which it has been very difficult with border movements, to be able to do that is good. I recognise that for a number of employers, they clearly wanted more people to come in. We've had some RSE workers stay the whole time here. It's not just a one-way street either. One of the issues we have is that some of the countries in the Pacific where people come from to do the RSE scheme are saying that if people come here, they won't let them back in. And so clearly that puts those workers in a very, very difficult position, and one that we wouldn't want to see them put in, and they themselves choose not to be. So the 2,000 workers compared to the half a dozen members of the Wiggles, and no, I don't have tickets to the Wiggles. I'm unfortunately not able to attend that on this particular tour, is actually part of what we call an economically significant set of workers. And look, that includes people who've come to fix turbines in some of our electricity generation plants where we've got specialist people through to other specialists that we require, plus sports teams and some artists as well. And that was a decision we made, that the vast bulk of the people coming through managed isolation would be returning New Zealanders to whom we have an obligation to allow them to return to their home country. But we would section off some of that for other things. And that's been part of making sure that New Zealanders have been able to live good lives. The America's Cup is an example of that. And that in turn has stimulated business activity around New Zealand. So, we've struck a balance there. The vast bulk of people are simply returning New Zealanders, very, very small number of people in the entertainment industry, and a much larger one in the area of the horticulture industry.
Talking about the America's Cup, I really enjoyed that. So if you contributed to that as Minister of Finance and Minister of Sport, that was great. We need all our businesses to be foiling, just like boats can. Now, housing, obviously, that was in the turned up on the agenda a lot here. And according to the 2018 census, there are 196,000 unoccupied houses in this country, with some 40,000 in Auckland alone. How can these empty houses be used to even partly solve the need for occupiable houses?
Yeah, this is a question that gets asked a lot, and we have done some work to investigate the extent of the problem. One of the issues around that census number is you are including in there batches, holiday homes, homes that are being renovated. There's a huge number of different factors within that very large number. But obviously there's a lot of anecdotal comment made about people being aware of empty houses, but the scale that is at when you dig into it is actually not large enough to make the big significant difference that people might think. Obviously, we'll continue to dig into that and see whether there is more information and whether or not there might be something we can do. But it's not currently a big part of our work program because, relatively speaking, it is not going to make the difference that we think it would need to be made there. And there are often very legitimate reasons why people are not living in their homes at a particular moment. Having said that, one of the things we've recently done with the Bright Line test change and the extension that we made the other day is that if something is an Airbnb property that a person does not live in, then that is now captured by the Bright Line test, which it wasn't up until now. So that's an example of how we can do some things to try and address parts of these issues. But actually, it is one of those situations where the data needs a bit more analysis than just the big top line number, because it captures a lot of things that I don't know that New Zealanders would be comfortable with us cracking down on, in terms of, for example, people just having batches and so on that they don't use all the time.
House values, we all know they've gone up, and you're doing your bit to stamp them down. Some people will agree you're doing the right thing, others will argue vehemently against it. But city council rates are based on house values. Are councils in for windfall rates when new values are used to calculate the rates payable?
I mean, obviously, the way in which council rating regimes work does vary a little bit around the country, but that is one of the issues one of the byproducts, as it were, of the housing market is what happens to the rateable value of properties. Obviously, the value inherent in a property is there when somebody sells it, and they get the gain from that. And so, at the moment, we don't have a particular focus on how it is that councils calculate that. What I would say is that in every council around New Zealand, there is pressure at the moment on councils to spend more, particularly on their infrastructure. And one of the sad realities is that over many decades in New Zealand, we haven't seen the investment in local government infrastructure that we should have. I live here in Wellington. We've got massive issues in terms of our water infrastructure. So do a number of other cities around New Zealand. And so it's not as if there's a shortage of need within councils. But, I encourage SMEs to engage with their local authorities around what's happening with rates and how that money is being utilised to support the kind of infrastructure and environment that will help small businesses thrive.
Thanks, Minister. This is a question in from a company that I know that employs 50 odd people. Why is the government introducing 10 days paid sick leave? What is their economic reasoning, and why does the government believe additional paid sick leave should fall as a cost to the employer? And would the government consider financing the expense of extra paid leave, sick leave themselves? And if not, why not?
So, and that's the thing about the question. No, we're not going to be doing that. Obviously, when we look at COVID, we've had it's brought into sharp relief the importance actually of making sure that we focus on the health and well-being of our whole population, and that we focus on particularly getting to an issue that has bedeviled us actually over many years, which is New Zealanders are pretty stoic people, and they find themselves going to work when they actually aren't well, and that in turn means that they make other workers in the workplace sick, and that ultimately actually has a negative turn on productivity within the workplace. Australia has this level of sick leave, so in some senses we're catching up to where the Australians are, but we think under COVID, this is time has highlighted to us the need to readdress where we are. On the detail of how that's going to work, that bill's going through the select committee process at the moment, and we're engaging very closely with business groups and also with worker representatives as well on trying to get a system that's effective and fair, that recognises the different employment arrangements that people have, because it's not quite as straightforward as it might have been once when people worked more regular hours. So there is a bit of work going on to make sure we get the detail of that right. But we think overall this is something that's good for New Zealand. Obviously, the government puts a huge amount of resource into the broader health system and to making sure that we help keep people well and get people back to work as soon as we can. We've got the ACC system as well, which is supported by levies by both workers and employers. So we feel like this is the right balance, recognising that it is a change, but one that I think overall will be good for New Zealand in terms of our health, wellbeing, and productivity.
Here's a question in from someone in the tourist sector. Due to the border closures, hundreds of inbound travel services are without business since April 20. Given the fact that the international travellers provide up to 1.8 billion in GST revenue alone, does the government intend to support them until the borders are open again? If so, how will the government support them? When will there be support available? Please be specific and provide us with a true picture on how the government sees this situation.
Yeah, and look, we're acutely aware that there are some very exposed sectors to what's happened with COVID-19, and tourism is clearly the most exposed sector of them all. So that's why we set up the $400 million tourism fund in the budget last year. Around about 300 million of that, I think, has gone out directly in grants to a range of tourism operators to be able to support them to continue operating. There's been a number of elements of that program beyond that, within the 400 million, but beyond the 300 million that's gone to regional tourism organisations to make sure we've got events running, to make sure that we've got support for people to be able to potentially transition their business to a different focus, or indeed to put it into hibernation for a period of time. So a big investment in regional business partner networks, again, mostly provided by chambers actually, to support people to be able to make those quite significant business decisions. So that $400 million package has gone out. Those of you who heard Minister Nash or read about Minister Nash's speech, he's also the Minister of Tourism as well as being the Minister of Small Business. He gave a speech in Queenstown last week where he outlined the focus for the government for the next phase of our direct support, particularly looking at regions that have been the most affected by the international tourism loss. We had, I think, about a 20% jump in domestic tourism, but while that's been good for a lot of businesses, it's clearly not going to make up for all of the international tourism loss. So we're looking at what kind of support we can provide to the most affected regions, but also start the process of shifting the tourism industry a bit. And in the period in 2018 and 2019, a lot of people were becoming worried about the sustainability of our tourism industry. We were really stretching, particularly the tourism hotspots. It was, infrastructure simply wasn't keeping up. We were struggling for staff. It was a really challenging time, and actually the visitor experience was starting to be detrimentally affected. And so in rebuilding the tourism industry out of COVID-19, we've got to be looking at doing things better, lifting the value of the tourists who come to New Zealand, improving the kind of offerings we've got to attract those sorts of people, and making sure broadly that the industry is more sustainable. Plus also starting to talk to some of those regions that are heavily reliant on international tourism about some diversification into other industries, so that there's a bit broader base. So all of those things Minister Nash outlined in that speech. We'll be discussing the exact dollars and cents that go with that. But then I just want to quickly finish to say that, within the broader schemes that we put in place, the tourism sector has been a big beneficiary of that. And the numbers I've done or had a look at recently is out of that wage subsidy scheme, about $1.8 billion of that went to the tourism industry. So it's a recognition across all of those things that we've done that we need to support the industry. But there's also a shared desire, I believe, to reset the industry in a way that is going to be a bit more sustainable in years to come.
Thank you, Minister. Here's one about social enterprises. Currently, social enterprises sit in a grey area between commercial and non-commercial projects. As such, these projects can make a huge difference to communities and become sustainable economic entities. They find it difficult to raise funding through the normal channels for not-for-profit funding, as they are commercial projects, but cannot raise funding through banks or get financial support from commercial channels as they are not commercial enough. Does the government have any plans to support the ongoing survival of social enterprises?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really legitimate question, and I think this is one that this government and the previous national government probably need to take on the chin. That the growth of social enterprises we haven't quite kept up with that in terms of regulation and in terms of the way we consider social enterprise. So I do know that Minister Radhakrishnan, who's the Minister for the Community and Voluntary Sector, and the Minister of Social Development have both been talking about how we can shift the focus around social enterprise beyond just some of the more traditional ways of thinking about them as not-for-profits to being more core to the way that we see prosperity and growth. And that means shifting a little bit across the way we think about them in government to more of an economic development focus. One area that we have been particularly focused on, which I think will be a significant assistance to social enterprise, but also to small business more broadly, is the way that we do government procurement. So we're up over $40 billion a year of money where the government buys goods and services, and still a lot of that is contained within very large contracts that is quite difficult for SMEs and social enterprise, for example, to be able to bid into. So we're looking at quite significant changes within the way we do procurement to make it easier to break contracts up a bit more. And Minister Nash is getting a lot of name checks today as the Minister of Economic Development is in charge of that piece of work. And we've already seen some progress there, but I'd like to see more to give, a slightly different set of criteria. We've got trade obligations, which mean we need to be careful about the way we change those procurement rules so that we don't cause problems for our own people who will be involved in offshore work in that space. But we do think that there's more that we can do there. And on social enterprises specifically, I was just had a meeting with the Akina Foundation a couple of weeks ago around these issues about procurement, but also more broadly what we can do. And I think it is an area where we can do better.
Now, a lot of landlords last week became quite grumpy. This is residential landlords because of the tax deductibility of their interest. It was called a tax loophole. Now, it was never a tax loophole. It was a legitimate way. It was a legitimate tax deductible expense. And having it called a loophole made a lot of landlords think they were cheating. Can you just clarify why it was ever called a loophole when in fact it wasn't? It was a legitimate tax deductible expense.
I'm certainly not at all surprised to hear an accountant tell me that. But look, this is not meant to be in any way a statement about landlords. I perfectly accept the fact that landlords were using the system as it's been set up. So it's not a statement about landlords in any way whatsoever. The reason we called it that is because for owner-occupiers, that ability is not available. And it's been available to those who have been investors and have had investment properties. So the loophole that we're closing is the difference between owner-occupiers and investors and speculators. Look, we've had a number of months now of completely unsustainable house price growth in New Zealand, and also a period of time where investors and speculators are making up a much greater percentage of those who are in the housing market. And, that is the opposite trend in terms of house prices anyway from what we were being advised would happen as a result of COVID. And so with what happened in the second half of last year, we have had to act. And we've been signalling for some time since the election that we would be moving to level the playing field a bit more for first home buyers and also work on measures to improve affordability. And so that's the package that we put out. We are consulting right now on the detail of how interest deductibility will work. That is what we do when we make any major tax changes. We make the change at a policy level, at a principle level, and then we work through the detail of how it will be rolled out. So that's no different than what we would have done for any other one. The other point that I think has been lost a bit in the debate over the last week or so is that for people who are currently making use of the deductibility rules, there is a phase-in period over the next 4 tax years to give people time to adjust, to make decisions about where they want to be investing their money or how they might finance themselves to do that investment if they want to carry on. And then secondly, it's important to note that those deductibility rules will still be available if you are investing in a new build. And that brings really, this issue of supply to the fore. There is no single silver bullet in the housing market. We have to work on this in a sustained way across both supply and demand issues. And so I recognise there is some change and some disruption here, but frankly speaking, we cannot afford to see the level of house price increases that we've seen in recent months. And if we in New Zealand believe in the idea that people should have a decent shot at owning their own home, then we are going to have to make some changes. And that's what we've done in this package.
Thank you, Minister. Now, you've mentioned Minister Stuart Nash several times. We're going to just put up a quick poll now. Should we invite you back again after your budget in May, or should we invite Stuart Nash? So maybe
where do I vote?
Pardon?
Where do I vote in this poll?
It'll just come up on the screen. So it's there now, is it? Oliver?
It is.
Thank you. Okay, now a new study has named New Zealand as the easiest place in the world to start a business, with some 40,000 starting between April and December last year. An astounding number. However, that stats show that 68% of them will not make it past 3 years. Why are we proud of it being easy to start a business if it leads to a high chance of failure? And should MB not demand a higher accountability on startup company directors because failed businesses often take others down with them?
Yeah, this is a really tough balancing act, isn't it? Because the reason we're proud, and it's this is across successive governments now, that the World Bank assesses us in that way, is that we want it to be easy for people to get into business. We don't want bureaucratic red tape and things that are going to hold people up from getting great ideas out there and making a living and a livelihood from it. And so I think we should be pleased that we don't have some of the levels of bureaucracy that make it much slower for people to do that. I think there's a different question though inside that, which is what is causing those businesses to fail. And one of the things that we have spent a lot of resource and time on over this period of COVID is the provision of business advice and support. And we put tens of millions of dollars actually into our regional business partner network to help people with their business planning, to help people with their growth forecasts, how they can manage that. Can they start moving up the value chain? How do they manage themselves through their obligations to tax and to other things? And so I think there is a role for us there, and in MB in particular, and I think that we're stepping up into that role. We certainly have been through COVID. We've obviously now got the Digital Boost program, which I can just do a little advert for people to have a look at that. Some of you might have seen the ads on TV for that. That is a program to specifically help support people to think about in the COVID and post-COVID world. What is your digital presence? How does that look like? What can that do to help sustain a business that you might be starting? So, look, we're never going to get to a position where there are no business failures because that is the essence in many ways of an entrepreneurial idea and system. What we do have to do is keep those supports around people. And I think in COVID, we've lifted our game in doing that, and we'll keep working with small businesses in particular on how we can do that best.
Right, I realise that we're just about out of time. I've got one more question, but I can tell you that you as the Minister of Finance are getting more votes than Honourable Stuart Nash. It's 56% to 44%. So
look, it's pretty close, and I reckon Stuart will do a good job. I'm going to put my vote in for Stuart now. Here we go.
So the last question is about electric vehicles. As electric commercial vehicles become available over the next few years, many of us business owners will be keen to replace our polluting diesel vans, utes and trucks with cleaner electric models. The price of these is very high, and our diesel vehicles will devalue rapidly once the new technology is readily available. Are there plans for the government to subsidise this shift to cleaner technology? Perhaps a buyback scheme or tax incentives to encourage older polluting vehicles off the road?
Yeah, look, and Minister of Transport Michael Wood earlier in the year flagged that we are looking at the ways in which we can provide incentives for the uptake of EVs, and so there'll be more to say about that in the future, in the near future, because we do recognise that this is one of those big transitional shifts that we're all going to need to make over the next few years. One of the big risks for us is if we stay idle for too long, we'll become the dumping ground for combustion engine vehicles from the rest of the world, because many other countries around the world are setting targets just as we have for our move towards decarbonisation in the transport area. And so we've got to move, and we will be doing that. It is really important that we show some leadership in the state sector, and so we're moving our vehicle fleet to EVs. We also hope that will stimulate a second-hand market, as well as the way in which fleet management works with the public sector will help drive some more of those vehicles into the second-hand market, which will also help. But absolute recognition that this is an area where if we want the change at the pace that we want it, then we're going to have to be an active player. So watch out for further announcements in this area in the coming months.
Look, Minister, thank you very much for your time today. You've been very generous. We've got so many questions on the screen, and others have come in via email that we just haven't got anywhere near them. I can tell everyone who registered for this webinar that a recording is available, and that will be sent out by a link later on today. Again, thank you, Minister. You are at least 2 body lengths ahead of Stuart Nash, so we might invite him for commentary later on in the year to talk about small
Perhaps
business.
we can do a double act. Maybe we can compromise.
Oh, 2 for the price of 1. That would be wonderful. Thank you, Minister. Really appreciate your time, and our audience would have enjoyed your answers, which were on the mark so many times. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks very much.